Kaye is the UN Special Rapporteur on Free Expression, a former State Department official, and a professor of law at UC Irvine. He's very interested in pragmatic solutions and a means of clearing away the broken language of our barbell world and restoring something like a sane center to civil discourse. David Kaye, welcome to the World Affairs Council. Now, before we begin, in the interest of full disclosure, as Julia said, I am a Google employee. I am the editorial director of Google Cloud. That's part of Google. It's different from YouTube, but discount my views accordingly. I think, it is important to state one's context to maximize free speech and healthy discourse. So let's begin. How would you describe the current problem of speech on the internet?
Well, so we'll start with a small question, I suppose.
Yeah.
So to a certain extent, the problems have been with us as long as we've had public conversation and public speech, right? What kind of speech in a public environment do we consider to be legitimate and illegitimate? In the United States, we tend to solve that around, well, Congress shall make no law around that, and there'll be a competition of ideas, and the good ideas will win. I think one of the real distinctions about the current situation online, and in particular around social media, which is what the book is focused on, is one, the scale. I mean, we're talking about massive amounts of video or text or image that are uploaded every minute. And some of that content is going to be edgy, some will be offensive, some might even incite violence. And so the situation for the companies, which is different than the old world of thinking about the regulation of speech, is that they have to deal with just a massive amount of content that can go viral very easily, a massive amount that can be amplified, really quite simply, and cause harms at scale that we didn't see in the past. And I think that might be one way to think about the difference.
Mm-hmm. Certainly scale is a huge issue. Mm-hmm. And social media is doing successfully what social media does, which is find groups and help them amplify themselves.
Yeah.
And I think what you're saying is, most of the time, cat fanciers, war veterans, people of alternative or minority views who want to find each other, fantastic. But even 1% or 2% of pernicious actors can start to become quite viral and a threat. For some reason, that vanishingly small amount can seem to suck out so much of the oxygen.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point, and the framing is important here. The framing is important because I think the way I presented it might have been a little bit dark, right? I mean, the internet is dark in a lot of our discussion, our public discussion around what's happening online, but a huge portion of it is indeed about connecting people who wouldn't otherwise be connected. I mean, giving people access to information in ways that is, historically unprecedented. I think we need to acknowledge that. And so part of the effort has to be, as one of the individuals who wrote an essay that I cite in the introduction, he said, how do we save the internet, right? How do we save that good part? How do we deal with the bad stuff that's out there, that small part of it, which attracts so much of our attention for good reason? How do we deal with that without undermining the good of the internet today? And I think that's just a major challenge for us and a major public policy challenge. It's not just a challenge that the companies, which have business interests at the end of the day, at their core, it's not just their problem to solve, it's all of our problem to consider as an urgent matter of public policy.
And that takes us almost into a kind of problematic territory right there, because we're talking about fundamentally a kind of political problem, right? Mm-hmm. And politics is not the art of the perfect. It's the art of managing discontent in some ways. Mm-hmm. And particularly where tech is concerned, there is this underlying expectation by government, promulgated by tech companies, by consumers, that we can wave the wand and everything's going to get fixed. Mm-hmm. And that's another way of saying we don't have to confront our dark or lazy natures in a way, right?
I think that's right. I mean, and we see this. So one of the sort of points, at least for American audiences in particular, that I'm trying to explain in the book, is the nature of the regulatory push in Europe and other parts of the world outside the United States. I mean, basically, and this might sound odd considering we're having this discussion in the United States, I mean, in the heart of the Silicon Valley, basically, the United States is not a part of the global conversation about how to deal with this problem.
Why is that?
Well, I think one is we have a kind of cult around the Constitution and the First Amendment that makes us, I think, focus on the companies in a way that suggests that, well, they're private companies, they can do whatever they want, and at the same time, there's this, a kind of valorization of the First Amendment and the idea that no restrictions are really possible when we talk about free speech. Around the world, the global conversation tends to focus around two separate axes. I would say one is a human rights axis. So the vocabulary that most people use around the world is, it's Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it basically says everyone shall have the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, and there's certain restrictions that may be available to them. That's the nature of the global conversation, and so governments are often used to regulating speech issues, and to do it, particularly in democratic societies, to do it in a way that hopefully is consistent with human rights law. But your point, I think, that you just raised is really important, and that is particularly now in Europe, the focus on tech solutions is overwhelming. Right? The tech companies can solve this with a magic wand. The magic wand happens to be artificial intelligence. You can do this. You can get rid of all the bad stuff. They use harsh language like eradicating hate speech when we know that eradication is never going to be the actual answer to this. There'll always be bad content online. But this is a discussion that's happening in many parts of the world, but is hardly even happening in the United States.
Yeah, well, to quote that eminent technology writer T.S. Eliot, they dream of a future so perfect they won't have to be good. Mm-hmm. And that's not going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, part of it might be also, that's a great quote, it might be also sort of the political leaders in Europe in particular who are pushing for this also see tech as a really great excuse. So, for example, the rise of populism, the rise of hatred, the rise of even instances of terrorism. For each incident that's happened over the last several years, American tech companies have often been sort of targeted as responsible at some level for that.
And, discounting my employer, I would say that arises without a lot of context. Mm-hmm. The 2008 financial crash has caused a lot of social discontent. The refugee crisis out of Syria and Libya has caused a lot of social discontent. Yeah. And they're throwing all this on the tech companies as being enablers of something that was going to be a social problem anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing about it is...
And yet they're not entirely wrong.
So they're not entirely wrong. We're like mind meld here, yeah. Right? So they're not entirely wrong to my mind, in the sense that I think, imagine that you are a European, right? Imagine that you're a European leader, or just a European who's participating in public debate in anywhere in any country in Europe. Right now, what you imagine is a public sphere that is dominated by American companies, and so many public leaders in Europe, even ones who really are committed to freedom of expression and human rights, and to public debate, they see it as a situation where they have very little control over the nature of that public sphere. And that's very troubling to many European leaders. And I think that part of the conversation over the last several years has been about how do we retake control over our public space? What is it that we should be demanding of the companies so that they actually take into account our understanding of what rights mean and what freedom of expression means on our continent?
Right. And this gets us into some problematic territory in a way, which is that is a powerful North Atlantic sensibility, akin to what created the United Nations. Mm-hmm. However, the world has become much more multipolar. Mm-hmm. Does what the Europeans want resonate in Africa, India, China, South America? are they setting a standard that the world wants?
This is one of the problems with not just the law or the policies that are promoted by Europeans, but the nature of the rhetoric around it. So I believe that Europeans have every right to be having this debate,
No question.
and to think through regulatory solutions to it. I mean, I'd rather they not regulate content, but they regulate around transparency and disclosure and public control rather than company control over certain kinds of content issues that we can talk about. But one of the problems is that the rhetoric around these issues is very easily manipulated by authoritarians, by others around the world. So whether we're talking about, new laws that criminalize content, really criminalize the platforms in a place like Singapore, or even in Australia, which is not an authoritarian country, but the debate around the dark side of the internet gives, particularly when we're talking about false information or hate speech or terrorist content, it gives these others who do not have good intentions. I should put Australia to the side for a moment, because I'm really thinking about the Turkeys and the Egypts and others. They're using the European example by saying, look, Europe is doing this. Europe is starting to regulate the internet. We will also, and their rules are much, much more draconian than what we're seeing come out of Europe.
Yes, and in every case, the high-level argument is around the preservation of social order, and instantly we're in definition land, right? How do you define some of these things like human rights, democracy, social order? But in some ways, what we're talking about here and the problem of language is a little bit akin to what I was talking about in the beginning with this barbell language we have of extremes right now.
Yeah.
When the language is problematic and tends to be extreme, and you can't find a social middle, I think in some ways the information is you're in a new landscape and you don't really know how to talk about it yet. And we have to find a way to get towards a healthy way of describing where we are that isn't in the older contexts.
Yeah.
And takes us into this new space in a healthy way and preserves some of the best parts of the older context.
Right. I think that's right. I mean, I think what we also need to be thinking about is how do we get the companies to provide us with sufficient information in order to have these kinds of public debates. So, I mean, a really nice example of this, although a bad example, although all nice examples are also bad examples in this space, is the debate.
You're giving away all your secrets,
But it's the debate around the Nancy Pelosi video.
Right.
So this doctored video. So like sort of keeping it local for a moment, right? So this was clearly a doctored video. I have no idea whether it was doctored and manipulated for nefarious purposes, but it was used for nefarious purposes, right? And so I think a question that arises from that is, right, what do we want the companies to do with that kind of content? Right? What do we want them to do with manipulated video? And one possibility, and I think this has been part of the problem, is that there are very obvious technical solutions to it. Right? You could take down the video, although it's already out in the wild of Fox News and other sources. So it's already out there. So even taking it down wouldn't serve all your purposes. You could slow down the virality of it to make sure it doesn't get amplified in the same way. That's a technical solution. Like all of these technical solutions might work, but those kind of cloud the real fundamental problem from my perspective. And that is, really two questions. One is who should be deciding whether that kind of content should stay up or be taken down, or some action be taken against that. Should that be the companies? If it's the companies, there's a lot of content out there that we're not going to like. Should we want profit-making companies? One European official called them to me the profit-making beasts of Silicon Valley. Should they be responsible for making those decisions? Or should there be some public role in making the decisions about what is legitimate and what is illegitimate content? And then the second part of it is, well, what should the rule be? Should it be that all manipulated video gets taken down? That would sweep in a lot of content that we probably enjoy, like satire and humor, and even mocking of public leaders, which, in the American experience is actually part of what we do.
Yeah.
And I think particularly in this environment, we should want to continue mocking our public leaders.
By the way, more power and keep going. But just to take you down into the engine room
Yeah.
a little bit, the profit-making beasts, these companies, they really don't like this stuff because
For sure.
if for nothing else, I mean, bad actors, horrible things, think of them what they will. It's also really bad for business.
Yeah.
Like a car company does not want to be up on your weird hate video,
Yeah.
you know, and that'll happen sometimes.
Yeah.
Or, you know, that nice toothpaste is suddenly associated with this weird social media post. They don't like that, and they will stop advertising.
Yeah.
This stuff is actually bad for business.
Absolutely.
And the Europeans, in portraying them as voracious, you know, relentless, money-hungry guys, don't understand that, like, this is actually bad for business.
No,
like, to portray them
right.
that way,
Yeah.
besides being cliched, is just functionally wrong.
So I agree with that, but I would also say that they are nonetheless profit oriented.
No question.
Right, and so
Their motives are clear.
Right, so they're not, and they shouldn't be expected to be. Well, there should be an expectation that they have the public's interest in mind.
Yes.
But we don't understand them as having to make their corporate decisions solely on the basis of public interest. So that's where I'm sort of focusing this particular
Yeah.
question of who do we want to make the decisions? Should it be corporate actors? Maybe. I mean, maybe they're in a better position. And in some places, we would much prefer, you know, Facebook or YouTube or Twitter to make a decision than a repressive government where they might be operating.
Well,
right?
yeah.
You know, but at the end of the day, that's still a fundamental public question for us to
Let's
to
spend a minute
grapple
on the
with.
companies because they do take up an enormous, certainly in the initial part of the book,
Yeah.
you get an enormous amount of attention.
Mm-hmm.
And you have an interesting view of them because, again, to reinforce this idea that it's a new landscape, it's almost like you don't know what to do with them. They're like multinationals, they're like supranationals, they're like regulators, they're like traditional public companies.
Yeah.
What's happened here? And is it just a function of scale? Is it more than that? Is it how the consumers work with them?
Yeah, I mean, it's all of that, and it's also that they have massive power in a public space that is relatively unusual. I mean, we could talk about different sort of global companies that have that have had massive power, you know, beyond their home of incorporation, let's say. But there's something special about these companies. On the one hand, I mean, this goes to like saving the good internet. They did provide this kind of cross-border global access to information and connection that is, you know, amazing, and we should celebrate that part. But they also do have this global power over public conversation and public space, and yet they are still very much American. And so, you know, I just like part of the book is trying to take that perspective that if you imagine yourself in one of these countries outside the United States where they do have this massive power. Now, outside of Europe, there aren't too many places where people feel like they can get access to the companies and actually articulate to the companies, look, this is what you are doing in our space. And so this massive power is something, I don't know, I'm a lawyer, so I'm also wary of saying things are absolutely new, but it's certainly unusual in the amount of control and the power that they have in the public sphere, let's say.
There are precursors, no question. I think what you have put your finger on that is new is scale. Scale and velocity. You know, we just haven't seen anything like that.
Yeah. And so there's scale, there's velocity, the amplification, all of those things. They're also, and this is one of the points that I think it's easy for us to imagine the companies as kind of flying by the seat of their pants, right? It's like, oh, there's this Nancy Pelosi video, we must take it down, and we must do something. But the truth is that they are rule-based organizations. They are, you know, there's variation among the companies. Facebook calls its policy-making meeting that it has every other week a mini legislative forum, right? They are like a governing body. And I mean, I've sat in on them. I describe it in the book. I mean, they really are performing a kind of governance. They see themselves as performing a kind of governance. And when you think about that as happening in Menlo Park over here for a global audience, That's striking. And for those global audiences, it's alienating and disconcerting in pretty fundamental ways. And that's why I think we'll see continually a kind of, certainly a jealousy over that control and an attempt to retake it.
I suppose the hopeful thing in what you're saying is, and there are precursor trends, and one of the strongest precursor trends to the internet is the post-World War II arrival on the global stage of democracy. Like, even countries that are under totalitarianism have an election. North Korea has an election. Like, what is that about? You know, and it's the idea that, like, basically we've all agreed democracy is a good thing. And the effort now is to, like, define that and amplify it, and individual lives matter, elevate them, you know, and all of that goes into that. And what you're saying is we're in this very difficult moment where probably the majority of people do not feel well represented by the interests of American companies or necessarily by the interests of European regulators.
Yeah.
But they're fighting for voice and really don't have consensus with each other. Like, the rest of the world is not a monolithic thing either.
Yeah. So, I mean, there could be a hopeful point in this. I think, there is one of the hopeful things that we might identify here, because we've got to have some hope. The world is grim.
The world is wonderful. It's not, we see, the other problem is we see this evil. And in this highly viral world, bad, scary things tend to catch.
Sure.
You know, better than, like, the video of my kid learning to walk just doesn't take off the way the video of the horrible shopkeeper being beat up takes off.
Yeah, no, that's true. And by saying the world is grim, I mean, I think, like, on balance, I mean, the world's a great place. But, you know, anyway, this was really more of a move to this other point, which is, I think, your mention of democratization, sort of the post-World War II efforts. You know, there's a lot of, like, democracy in form, but totally not in substance.
Sure.
And so one of the things that I think the platforms, like, if they do think, if the companies did think about the reach that they have, and they don't need to be proselytizing by any measure, because I think people would find that also to be disconcerting, but they do create a kind of space for people to engage in seeking information that they can't otherwise get in their own environments, right? So just as a little bit of an example, I was in Cambodia in the very beginning of January, and our driver during one of our trips, you know, was talking a little bit about politics, in part because everywhere we went, we saw posters of Hun Sen, moving increasingly towards autocracy, leader of Cambodia, and he's also captured a lot of state media. And so my driver was suggesting that, you know, he didn't really like Hun Sen. He was very upset about the nature of politics. And we had to know, well, where do you learn that? I mean, media has been really taken by government. It's very state controlled. And without missing a beat, he said Facebook. And, you know, so he gets the information from a community of people who are on Facebook, who are sharing information on Facebook, that the government of Cambodia has had very little success in tamping down on. Like, that part of it, like that giving people access to, is the thing that we do want to preserve. Again, without being in the, like, democracy promotion camp of, you know, that many in the United States might be, but in the, like, providing the space for that kind of, you know, what we think of as natural communication, which is very unusual for many people. Like, that's the kind of thing we want to find a way to preserve, and that we should be, I think, incentivizing the companies to do. But at the same time, we still need to deal with the nature of the bad stuff online, and we need to be thinking through, what does it mean to regulate the companies so that they deal with that that bad content.
And just as a reality check, because the horrible things are so vivid and just so they jump and they travel everywhere, are we fetishizing them? I mean, I did being the kind of person I am, I did a recent greatest hits of really horrible people and things, and Tim McVeigh, the Rwanda genocide, Eric Robert Rudolph, David Koresh, Ramzi Youssef, and Jim Jones, in recent memory, committed horrible acts without social media involved in any step of it, all right? So has this always been with us, and we just have a better window on it now? Or is is this something more pernicious and dangerous that we really have to stop?
You're right. I mean, we've always had violence. We've always had hatred. We've always had, these forms of abuse that have been, pre-digital, like real abuse in the real world. I think that, and I think that when you look at something, for example, like the Christchurch massacre occurred just a couple of months ago, which was awful at so many levels. And I guess your question leads to a question about whether social media played a role either in kind of incentivizing this monster to do this kind of attack on Muslims in New Zealand, or whether it was something that was, that would happen anyway with or without social media. And I think that, this is actually a place where we do need to pause. Like, this is a space where we actually need some really good empirical research around the role that social media plays in, some of these really bad acts. And this has been a problem because the companies, and you mentioned the word opaque in the introduction, the companies have been very closed in terms of sharing information about what happens on their platforms. And so when we see something like the Christchurch massacre, or we see something like the use of social media around the Sri Lanka massacre more recently, or any other social media trauma of the last several years, the companies have just not been open about giving to researchers the opportunity to explore and to really conduct real research into the relationship between social media and violence.
Yes.
And I think we have some assumptions around it, but we don't have really great research about it.
Well, there are at least two things I can think of that do, I wouldn't say justify that, but provide some reason for that action. One is, on a corporatist level, these are viewed as trade secrets. Mm-hmm. More pragmatically, if you expose it, that's like inviting people to game it. Mm-hmm. Like once you are not opaque, you can get clever people, even in hostile governments, figuring out, okay, how do I get around that? Here's their path of thinking. Mm-hmm. Here's their design effect. Mm-hmm. Here's what they do. So to expose it raises the prospect of making it much worse because they'll spoof you.
But they could expose it to researchers. They can have,
take it to a clean room, basically.
Yeah, you've got NDAs. Like everybody has an NDA in the Bay Area, right? For whatever it might be. So, this would be the kind of. I'm from Los Angeles. I got to make some hits against the Bay Area once in a while.
I'm not allowed to talk about my NDA. I have an NDA on my NDA.
But you could imagine providing access. There are some problems that have developed recently. So, for example, the new privacy law in Europe is actually making it paradoxically harder. Even though Europeans want more information, it's making it harder for the companies to share information because of privacy concerns. But putting that aside, the companies could very easily share information with researchers in order to do some of this, even, with like sort of all of the protections that you might have around subjects and that we have in academic research. They could do that, and it's been very hard, particularly with Facebook, to be honest. Some of the other companies have been more open to sharing their APIs and providing access. But we really need that in order to answer some of these really difficult empirical questions about what's new.
What you mentioned about Christchurch identifies another point, which is this idea of virality and doing things for fame or voice. To broadcast your massacre live is a horrifying activity guaranteed to glorify yourself. Mm-hmm. And when that arose, other people passed it around. Mm-hmm. In the horrifying moment of increasing their virality. Yeah. They may not have even been in this guy's camp, but they knew that passing that around would give them authority and generate attention to them, and they were just delivering news, man, but actually they're motivated by clicks. Yeah. And it's interesting in this regard that the New Zealand authorities willfully obscured the name of this guy who did it. And in Virginia Beach, where there was a shooting just this week, they said, we're going to announce this guy's name once, and that's it. And they're sort of, the good antibodies are sort of figuring out, like, this is not going to help your virality.
Right.
You will not be famous for your horrible
Yeah,
act.
right.
We will focus on the humans to whom a horrible thing happened.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to watch the ecosystem kind of try to correct for this.
Right, and I think that's that does show a kind of a course correction on some of these things that's really important. But the issue of the live streaming also raises all of these questions that go to the heart of what I'm trying to get at in the book, which is around the rules. So one of the responses, and this is part of the Christchurch call, and it's also part of Christchurch call was this sort of New Zealand and French initiative to basically say to the companies, you need to do better. Australia adopted this law, it was proposed on a Tuesday, adopted on Thursday, also around live streaming. So the question for us as a community really is, okay, so do we want live streaming to be unavailable to people? I mean, that's sort of where this is kind of heading. And I think it forces us to think about, like, are there positive uses of live streaming, which we have seen in terms of individual interactions with the police, for example, or even just the sharing of public protest, for example. So there are some really strong reasons that support live streaming. And so as we think this through, again, it's because it has this massive impact on the public and on public life and on public institutions. It seems a little inappropriate, to me at least, to say, well, companies, you should figure this out. So governments are going to figure it out, and we could talk about what the rule might be around live streaming a video, but we're not even really having the discussion about, like, what's proportionate here. Like, if we say there should be a rule that deals with live streaming about massacres, okay, how do we construct that rule so it also preserves our ability to promote public protest, police abuse, and so forth? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of a matter of public lawmaking. That governments are saying to the companies, you fix this, and that seems there's a mismatch there.
You've taken us into a very interesting kind of legal philosophical area here, which is you believe free speech is a right, correct?
Sure.
Are the motivations to speech also a right? That is to say, profit off ads, virality, attention. Are those motivations behind speech also a right, or are they a privilege?
Well, yeah, that is philosophical.
Well, then you start making laws around it once you figure it out,
yeah,
right?
so I want to resist, because I like that question. I mean, I teach law, so I mean, I love it. I guess I want to answer it from a slightly different perspective.
I mean, I'm allowed to say things. Am I allowed to have them broadly broadcast and shared to a maximum extent?
Okay, so that's a slightly different kind of question, but
my motivation is virality.
Yeah. So if that's your motivation, right? So first of all, there's no obligation on the companies to enable all content to be viral.
Yes.
Like they don't have an obligation around that. I mean, I do think there's an obligation. Well, I'm not sure I would call it an obligation, but I would say that there's a public expectation that there will be neutrality around what the companies allow and disallow to become viral. So then the question becomes, what should be the nature of the restrictions on that, right? And so in First Amendment thinking, and we're all kind of marinated, just like all of the content policy people at all the companies, we're all marinated in a First Amendment kind of approach, right? Like whether we like it or not, or whether we know it, consciously or not, our belief in free speech, the idea that Congress shall make no law, right, abridging freedom of the press or freedom of speech, that's a very, very much a part of our culture. Human rights human rights law flips it around, and this is where I want to get at sort of the global vocabulary. So human rights law says everyone has these rights. Mm-hmm. States can restrict expression as long as it's sort of provided by law, so it's kind of a clear rule, and it's necessary in order to protect a legitimate interest. And that legitimate interest might be the rights of others. So it might be to protect the privacy of others, or it might be national security or public order, or something like that. But there's a set of legitimate objectives that can be protected. If we think of it in those terms, then I think that the question of motivation should be less important to us than the impact and the harm that might be caused, whether it's harm to an individual or to the public institutions. At least that's the way much of the rest of the world conceives of free speech questions. And that kind of flipping it around, I think, is actually a useful way of thinking about these questions in an age of social media where we're talking so much about the nature of these harms.
Okay, you're starting to talk about this new landscape with some detail now. And let's explore that a little bit. Let's pull on this a little bit. Can we have global platforms and globally appropriate policies around them? Or do we have localization all the time? And is the localization around political boundaries?
Yeah, I mean, myself, I prefer the idea of global rules with context-specific application of those rules, right? So, I mean, if you think about the way law, or particularly either First Amendment law or, freedom of expression law as a matter of human rights, we have global rules, right? So we have global rules that protect everyone's right to freedom of expression, and we have different kinds of contexts in which those arise. So, for example, a kind of, I mean, I don't want to give an example of hate speech, but you could imagine some kind of hate speech that in an American context might not incite any kind of violence. It might not even risk inciting any kind of violence. It might even be ignored by most people, maybe by all people. That very same content might have a very different impact if you're in Myanmar, or if you're in Turkey, or you're in any other place that you could imagine, even at a very local level. So the global standard could be the same, but the context of its application is going to be different because you think about the nature of the speech and its harm or its benefit in a particular environment.
Can you have a global standard, locally interpreted, that says something meaningful beyond people should be good or speech should be free? Can we actually dig into this a little further and say things like, what, if harm occurs or if this leads to unrest?
Yeah, I mean, around hate speech, by the way, is not a term of art as a legal matter, right? So it tends to be hatred that constitutes incitement to violence or discrimination or hostility. That's the sort of the legal framework as a matter of human rights law. And I mean, it's usually a surprise to Americans, but there's a lot of jurisprudence around what is hate speech, right? There's a lot of rulemaking at the international level, at the European level, at the inter-American level, even at the African level, which has a new set of regional courts. There's a lot of law there that the companies can draw upon in making the application of those rules in particular contexts. I think that's completely available to them. A totally separate question is whether it's feasible. Like whether the companies themselves, as major companies with billions of users all over the world, whether they actually have the capacity to protect the public in all of these different places around the world. Given the current makeup of the companies, and I mean the general lack of diversity at the most senior levels of the companies, but I also mean their location in Northern California. Again, nothing wrong with Northern California. Go Bears. I'm a Berkeley person myself. But sort of the distance from the places around the world where they're operating does make me wonder whether this particular problem of their ability to actually understand the context in places around the world, whether that's a solvable problem. I don't know if that's true.
Let the folks out there in radio land know this is a discussion between two old white guys.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, this is a, the point about.
We need to let more voices in.
It's also more than more voices. It's communities. And I know that's what you meant by voices, but it's really the fact that so many communities, and it's not just national communities. It could be communities of affinity. It can be communities of ethnic background or communities of sexual orientation or gender. I mean, there's all sorts of different
communities. All those great things social media has surfaced.
Right. They've really helped to create global communities around these things. And oftentimes those communities feel alienated from the not necessarily the rule making, but the implementation and the enforcement of those rules. They find that very often governments actually interfere so much that they harm them and the companies aren't there to protect them.
Well, we have questions from the audience, and the first one
Great.
is exploring this new landscape with us. I'm really grateful for this. Is one solution to evolve the AI filter? How much of an answer is artificial intelligence as a policing agent inside this?
So I think AI is like a must-have technology for companies at scale. I mean, there's no question that the companies need to have different mechanisms to surface the problematic content. I mean, we can't rely on users. I mean, not that users are bad people, but you can't rely just on users flagging all the information. The users themselves can't be the speech police, let me say, right, of the platforms. That's just not really a workable way to think about this over time. So AI should be part of the solution, and it's clearly already a part of what the companies are kind of promoting. The problem is AI is just a technology, right? So the AI isn't just a kind of, here's your code, go about and figure out what should be taken down. It's not at that level. You still need to have rules that feed the AI. I mean, the AI is framed by a particular rule, right? An algorithm is just, are you going in this direction? Are you going in that direction? That fork has to be defined by humans making a decision about what the rule is. So once you decide what the rule is, you can use AI, but you also don't, at least I don't think we want AI to be making decisions without the input of human beings.
Right.
They can filter, and the question did use the word filter. They can filter, provide, at least some basis, particularly around text, around imagery that is going to be problematic, which can be, put into a database, particularly around child endangerment or issues around terrorism. Oftentimes, those can be kind of hashed and then dealt with over time, meaning you could have a database and then through an algorithm that stuff can be taken down. But for some of the hardest stuff that deals with context, the most AI can do is provide it put it in queue for a human to review it.
And additionally, AI is a running commentary on its own data set, right? And it never, until very recently, didn't take into account, I wonder if some lunatic with a gun is going to live stream his massacre. That wasn't something we were doing until very recently.
Yeah.
And AI was just not going to find that.
Right.
Because there's no data indication.
Yeah.
The other difficulty, and let's spend a minute on a story. My old employer, the New York Times, recently had a story about the use of AI at Facebook for blocking, and quoted this guy saying, we'll never solve this. I felt it was sort of a gotcha, they can't solve it. But the reality is, Facebook has 960 million posts and photographs going up every day. And so I did the math. I thought, okay, what's the safest tech thing going? Probably airlines, right? Commercial airlines are really safe. And if we got to a safety level of commercial airlines with all those Facebook posts, which would be amazing because it's a much harder problem than airlines, there'd still be more than one a day. You just with this, again, it's a scale problem.
Yeah, so it's about mitigation rather than complete elimination. But there's something else to say. I mean, there's a lot to say about algorithmic decision making. But one other thing that I think is really important is, I think there's a perception and a reality that. And this is, perhaps even more acute on YouTube than some of the other platforms, that that the algorithms are kind of juiced for virality, right? And it goes to your barbell metaphor at the beginning. So the extremes get surfaced, relatively more quickly than some of the, sort of pragmatic solution kinds of videos and posts. And so that means that, when we're looking at algorithms, so there's the rule, but there's also, the nature of, what does the company value?
Right.
And part of that is absolutely about clickbait and virality, that, the companies will say, look, we want to protect the public and so forth, but they also, make money hand over fist on the virality of content. And some of their content providers, the creators on the platform also make a lot of money from that virality. So, that's a business model problem that is baked into the algorithm right now, and is also part of this question about whether, a mechanism that would deal with AI, that would deal with algorithmic decision making, that would be more prone to protecting the public, might interfere with some of the virality that is actually something that the companies actually like to promote.
Well, not necessarily. One could say, if something comes up viral, particularly from an unusual area, and it's being passed around in communities we know to be problematic, put that to the front of the queue. Like, watch that and surface it to a human faster. But didn't I just profile a bunch of people by saying this community shares this stuff?
Yeah.
So we're going to start profiling.
Yeah. Well, this is the problem. So every solution creates its whole set of new problems. And that is, so AI provides a kind of a necessary mechanism for dealing with the scale that you identified, but it's also going to create a whole set of problems. I know I'm here to talk about my book, but there's another book that I would promote, which is Safiya Noble wrote a book called Algorithms of Oppression. And for people who are interested on the algorithmic side, it's really a valuable book to see how bias is often baked into the algorithms. And racism is often baked into the algorithms, and not necessarily in an intentional way. It's because some of it is implicit in the nature of public decision making right now and institutional decision making. And so, I think there's a lot of space for creating. It's not just creating algorithms that are fair, but are also designed to deal with some of the problems that we're talking about.
I have another question from the audience. What about smaller social networks like Gab? Are they a real threat? And spend a minute on Gab for those who don't know it.
Yeah. So Gab, I think it's seen as much today as a platform for white supremacists, kind of a space for people to go because their
where
content.
white supremacists can get together and share.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So everybody should share.
Do some hating.
Right. Yeah. So people who no longer or couldn't do that on, say, Facebook, found their community over there. So I come to this from the human rights perspective, and there's actually a whole world of thinking around the responsibilities of companies to protect the rights of individuals, protect the rights of users, to protect the rights of the public. And I think a lot of what we're talking about, although my book is really focused on those companies with massive impact, really the big three, right? YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. But there's still a space, and this is where, in the United States, where there is a little bit more competition among the platforms, where I think we're willing to accept there to be some places, not necessarily white supremacist content that's inciting violence.
The follow-on question is, should Gab exist?
Yeah.
That's a good question.
Yeah, I think that rather than thinking about whether Gab should exist, if we're thinking, should there be platforms that allow for white supremacists or any other kind of, say, violence, because this is just an American phenomenon here, but this exists in many places around the world. Should there be places for them to gather and to incite violence and to coordinate? No. On
the other hand, if you knock them out, you're creating that highly desired social media profile, the victim.
Well, that's true. And the other point is that, people will always find their space, right? People will always, maybe, so we talk about Gab here. It could also be, on your Xbox or, different kinds of, gaming communities that develop, and they use that space in order to coordinate and to share. Maybe it's misinformation, maybe it's racist information and white supremacist information, whatever it might be. People are finding their space to do that. So we obviously have a broader problem than just a platform problem, right? We have a public policy problem. And that's in part, again, where I'm trying to make an argument for public policy to be a part of the solution around this. And it would apply just as much to a platform like Gab as it would to a platform like Facebook. The solutions may be different, but the issues are not all that different.
Perhaps the most vigorous public policy move so far was, I don't know how to say NetzDG, the German.
Yeah.
Did I get that right?
I don't speak
Close
German.
enough, okay.
I mean, if you said it in German, it would be 10-minute words.
The question from the audience is, talk about that, the historical idea, the issues it raised, and why you ended up kind of opposed to it in your book.
Yeah. So NetzDG, again, it's the shortened version of, in German, it's the Network Enforcement Act. It was a law that was developed in 2017, became effective at the beginning of 2018. It's a German law, and the backstory is pretty interesting. So if you put yourself, and so if I can just take a few moments to connect it to public policy, right? So you might all remember 2015. You might remember it fondly, but 2015 in Germany was a moment when there was a huge influx of refugees, people fleeing violence of Syria and Libya in particular, some other places, but particularly those countries. And Angela Merkel said, we're going to welcome 1 million migrants/refugees, right? We're going to welcome them into our country. I mean, to me, it was an amazing statement. It was like a new, for somebody who grew up when I did and thought of Germany and kind of the sort of the post-Holocaust Germany, it was like a remarkable statement, right, for a German leader to say, we're going to welcome mainly Muslims into our country. And it was welcomed by a huge portion of Germans, but resisted by many, many others. And on social media, you started to see develop in 2015 tremendous amount of hatred, incitement to violence, and discrimination. And at the time, the Minister of Justice, a guy named Heiko Maas, saw this, and he was getting a lot of criticism from Germans who were saying, why is Facebook so willing to take down, a nipple, an image of a nipple, a female nipple, moreover, but not take down all of this hateful speech? And so Heiko Maas started this process of talking to the companies and getting them to agree voluntarily to deal with hate speech. So over time, so he got this agreement from them. It was a soft law agreement. It wasn't, law, but it was a voluntary agreement. And Heiko Maas saw that the companies that were not doing what he expected that they would do. So he moved from this kind of soft voluntary process into creating this law, the NetzDG. And what NetzDG does is it says to the companies, you need to have policies and processes and rules to take down content that is inconsistent with German law, which is fine. Like at some level, as a matter of public policy and as a government saying, we want you to observe our law, that should be reasonable, right? But what they basically said to the companies was, you adjudicate what's lawful and what's not. And that law was, when you look at German law, it's not always clear as to what, for example, constitutes criminal insult, right, which is illegal under German law. And so it was basically an outsourcing to the companies of decisions about what's legal and not under German law. And I think that's problematic because what it does is, on the one hand, it increases the power of the companies in a paradoxical kind of way, but it also, over time, it takes away public institutions from this, fundamental question of interpreting what is German law.
Yeah, they're kind of abdicating, aren't they?
They're abdicating that role. And I think the suggestion in the NetzDG process is, to my way of thinking about it is, governments, to abstract out to all governments are not really doing the creative, hard thinking about what it might mean in a social media age to deal with this kind of content and to deal with it in a way that would allow our public institutions to still be involved in the decision-making and the interpretation of what is legal and what's not. Mm-hmm. They're just not having that kind of careful thinking. Now there is, I'll end here on this particular point because the French government commissioned this body, a kind of task force, to think through what good regulation might look like in this space. And they, just a month ago, released a document that is actually pretty interesting along these lines, that suggests that there might be space for public institutions to do some of this. So maybe we're seeing the beginning of some governmental creative thinking around this. But so far we haven't seen it. We certainly haven't seen it in Washington, which everything is politicized and has turned into a partisan show. In Europe, they've done it. They've tried to be careful on some issues, but they really haven't grappled with what does it mean for our public institutions to be involved in this.
We keep doing Europe and North America. Are you seeing interesting, forward-looking, productive, or any other kind of conversation in the rest of the world?
Not much.
So it's the North
sadly.
Atlantic is just going to lead this thing?
Well, I think what we're seeing is we're seeing new laws in places like Singapore, where, again, criminalizing content. We see in Kenya another example where there's the criminalization of disseminating false information, which, to the credit of the Kenyan courts, that law has been put on hold. So there's all sorts of examples out there where governments, yes, they're grappling with it, but they're coming up with solutions often that ultimately harm those who most need space, like those who are critical of government.
From what you're saying as well, they're committing a very common kind of move, which is creating ways of trying to preserve the past and their power.
Yeah.
More than accepting they're in a new landscape and how's this going to work productively for the betterment of the society.
Right. I think that's right. And I think there's also, one of the things is that in many parts of the world, the judicial institutions are not always up to the task of doing some of the work that I'm thinking would be a creative way of developing new court systems. Part it might be independence, in part it might be resources. There are good examples. To give one example, in India, there's been some really interesting and actually important decisions out of the Indian Supreme Court to preserve space for speech online and to keep government out of the decision around what is good content and bad content. There are some good examples out there, but as kind of a comprehensive solution to the kind of content that we're talking about, particularly hate speech and disinformation, there have not been really strong solutions to the problem.
Now, there may be a corollary here. One of the interesting things I've seen for affecting social betterment is in the case of human trafficking and bonded servitude, modern-day slavery, the International Justice Mission has an approach of going to the country and saying, you have laws on the books against this, enforce them.
Yeah.
And they just surface the problem right in the country. And maybe something like that needs to take place as well.
Well, that's part of the reason why I advocate for human rights standards to be basically the focal point for company rules. So company rules right now are their terms of service, and it's discretionary, right? So the companies can decide what's good, what's bad, and that might be okay. But if they root their decision making in human rights standards, then when they go to different countries, just like International Justice Mission, when they go to different countries, they can say, look, our standards are the same as your obligations under human rights law. It might not mean that that Turkey will suddenly say, oh, right, these are our obligations. We will protect journalists and public speech.
I'm not expecting miracles.
Right,
but
we can't expect that.
It takes the imperialistic existential threat to our society stuff a little bit off the table.
Yeah. I think it at least it gives the companies a bit of a tool, like if we think of them, at least in part, as protecting their users. Now, I think of this in a way like, Colin Powell's Pottery Barn rule, which he didn't follow through on during the Iraq War, which is, you break it, you own it. I think here, the question might be more, you built it, you own it. Right? And so companies built these processes. They make their platforms available. They create things like Facebook Basics, which really dominates the internet in many parts of the world and sort of is the internet for many people around the world. And then there are all these problems on it. And they say, well, what can we do? We don't know how to solve it. Well, the truth is you built the platform. You have a responsibility to do it.
For the folks out there in Radioland, again, I feel mindful to point out that I, Quentin Hardy, am a Google employee. These are my opinions up here. I do not speak for Google in any form tonight.
Yeah.
We have a question from the audience. Just to compound the problem a little bit, I want to take this. The question is, images and soundtracks can be manipulated. Can some kind of watermark type code be developed and embedded in images and soundtracks that creates a kind of authenticity? Is there a tech solution? Well, you know, there might be, but here's another interesting problem. I have a friend over at Amnesty who looked at some of this stuff. And if you surface something and put on it, we think this is fake, it doesn't seem to slow people down from passing it on. And that's just this kind of civics problem. People need to know how to, there needs to be a lower status given to passing around fake stuff and bad stuff.
Yeah, so there might be, so it's like a DRM solution, right? To false information.
Except it doesn't seem to slow people down.
So it might not slow people down. The other problem might be some kind of content, right? So you think of satire, right? Like when you see a satirical video, if it's labeled satire up front, like that defeats the purpose of the satire. So, you know, it might still be possible to create some mechanism, but I still think, and I appreciate the question because I do think we need to be thinking about technical solutions to deal with some of the amplification and virality issues. But it's still, it doesn't, you know, obviate the need to make decisions about what the rules are. So what kind of content actually gets that? Is it any manipulated content? I actually think it's harder to identify manipulated content than we might think. And the other part of it is much of this depends on timeliness, right? So if that video, that manipulated video is not caught, if it's not surfaced within a day or two, well, all it takes is, you know, name your media source, let's say Fox News, to pick it up and amplify it, and then it gets into the media ecosystem. And it has very little to do with the social media ecosystem at that point, right? So, you know, thinking these things through requires us to think, well, you know, what do you do in that immediate space when it's most important to deal
that
with
actually is another audience question. What about other media like TV and radio and newspapers? Aren't they a precursor, and don't they similarly bias and cause some of the same problems? Particularly now that they are also highly attuned to virality, clicks, their business requires that attention getting.
I mean, I think there's a real serious conversation that we have to have with traditional media about the way in which, because they have a different tradition, right? An editorial tradition that's very different than social media's. And so they can exercise much more of their responsibility, their professional responsibility, in order to decide, well, we don't need to help make viral content that we would never publish ourselves. Like that can be part of their discussion. And we've always accepted that, you know, newspapers, broadcast media, radio have that kind of, you know, right to decide what they air and what they don't air. And they could exercise some responsibility around that as well.
David, I wish we had more time, but unfortunately, that's all the time we have for tonight. On behalf of World Affairs, I want to ask you to join me once again in thanking David Kaye for his wonderful discussion tonight. Many thanks to, as well as you, the audience, for these wonderful questions. Good night.
Thank you.